The torches burned low in the palace at Babylon. Outside, the air was heavy with dust and heat, and inside, whispers moved faster than footsteps. The greatest conqueror the world had ever seen lay surrounded by generals who no longer knew whether they served a king or feared a tyrant. How does a hero become something darker? How does a man worshipped as a liberator begin to lose the trust of his own people? And was Alexander, once the fearless son of Macedon, slowly transforming into the very kind of ruler he had sworn to defeat? To understand the final years of Alexander's life, we must return to the beginning, to a young king whose ambition burned brighter than reason, whose victories reshaped continents, and whose transformation would leave even his closest companions uncertain of who he had become. At first, he was everything a Macedonian warrior admired. He rode with his soldiers, fought at the front lines, bled alongside them. He slept little, trained constantly, and shared in their hardships. His charisma felt almost divine, but it was rooted in something familiar: courage, loyalty, and a shared identity. The Macedonians followed him not only because he conquered, but because he was one of them. The early campaigns against Persia felt like a mission of liberation. Greek cities freed, Persian armies shattered, a young king fulfilling the dreams of his father and surpassing them. But as the empire expanded, so too did the distance between Alexander and the world he had known. Victory after victory pushed him deeper into Asia, further from the rugged hills of Macedon, further from the culture that had shaped him. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to change. The turning point did not arrive with a single moment. It emerged through a series of choices. After the conquest of Persia, Alexander faced a dilemma few conquerors had survived: how to rule a world that was not his own. Persian kings had ruled through ritual, distance, and divine authority. They wore elaborate robes, demanded ceremonial gestures of submission, and maintained a sacred aura that separated ruler from subject. Alexander began to adopt these customs. At first, it seemed practical. He needed the loyalty of Persian elites. He needed stability across vast territories. But to his Macedonian companions, the transformation felt unsettling. The king who once drank and joked freely with his generals now appeared dressed in foreign robes, surrounded by court ceremonies that felt alien and excessive. He introduced the idea of proskynesis, the Persian gesture of bowing or prostration before the king. To Persians, it symbolized respect for divine kingship. To Macedonians, it felt like worship. They had never bowed to their king. They had stood beside him. And now, the line between companion and subject began to blur. Some saw adaptation, others saw betrayal. Alexander's belief in his own destiny also deepened. Throughout his campaigns, stories of divine parentage had followed him. The oracle at Siwa had addressed him as the son of Zeus Ammon. Soldiers whispered that no mortal could achieve such victories. Perhaps he began to believe it, or perhaps he simply understood the power of myth. Either way, the image of Alexander shifted from heroic leader to something closer to a living god, and with divinity came distance. The old atmosphere of shared brotherhood faded. The court grew more formal, the king less accessible. Suspicion crept into relationships that had once been unbreakable. The first great fracture came with the execution of Philotas, son of Parmenion, one of Alexander's most trusted generals. Accused of failing to report a conspiracy, Philotas was arrested, tortured, and executed. The shock rippled through the army. Parmenion, a veteran commander who had served Alexander's father, was assassinated shortly after. Killed not on the battlefield, but by orders carried across the empire. To some, it was ruthless necessity. To others, it was the moment Alexander crossed a line. Trust began to erode. Whispers replaced laughter in the campfires at night. The transformation continued. The court became increasingly Persian in style. Persian nobles were elevated to positions of power. Intermarriages were encouraged between Macedonians and local elites. Alexander seemed determined to fuse cultures into something new. But unity imposed from above can feel like betrayal from below. Many Macedonians believed their identity was being erased. Resentment simmered beneath loyalty. And then came one of the darkest nights of Alexander's life. At a banquet, fueled by alcohol and tension, a heated argument erupted between Alexander and Cleitus the Black, a man who had once saved his life in battle. Cleitus criticized Alexander's adoption of Persian customs, accusing him of abandoning Macedonian traditions. The words struck deep. Perhaps they touched doubts Alexander himself could not face. The argument escalated. Voices rose. Friends tried to intervene. And in a moment of uncontrollable rage, Alexander seized a spear and killed Cleitus. Silence followed. Not the silence of victory, the silence of horror. Alexander reportedly collapsed into grief almost immediately, refusing food and sleep, overwhelmed by remorse. But the damage was done. If even Cleitus could die at the king's hand, who was safe? Fear replaced familiarity, and as fear grew, so too did isolation. Another figure would soon fall. Callisthenes, historian and relative of Aristotle, who openly resisted proskynesis. Accused of involvement in a conspiracy, he was arrested and died in captivity. Whether guilty or not mattered less than the message. Dissent had consequences. Alexander's empire was at its greatest extent, yet his relationships were at their weakest. The march into India exposed the growing fracture between king and army. The soldiers had followed him across deserts, mountains, and endless wars. They were tired, homesick, wounded in body and spirit. When Alexander insisted on pushing further east beyond the Hyphasis River, the army refused. It was not a minor disagreement. It was mutiny. For days, tension filled the air as king and soldiers faced one another, across a divide neither fully understood. In the end, Alexander relented. The invincible conqueror bowed not to enemies, but to the will of his own men. But the trust between them had changed forever. The return journey was brutal, marked by suffering and loss. Storms, hunger, and deadly marches through unforgiving landscapes tested loyalty to its limits. By the time Alexander reached Persia again, the atmosphere surrounding him had transformed. He attempted grand gestures of unity, organizing mass marriages between Macedonians and Persian women, celebrating a vision of a merged empire. Yet many saw only alienation. At Opis, tensions exploded. Alexander announced the integration of Persian soldiers into his army, even training them in Macedonian fighting styles. The Macedonians felt replaced. Their anger erupted into open rebellion. Alexander responded with fury, executing ringleaders, delivering a speech that mixed rage, disappointment, and wounded pride. He accused his own soldiers of ingratitude. The emotional distance between king and army became undeniable. Yet moments later, reconciliation followed. Tears, embraces, celebrations. Alexander still possessed the charisma to heal wounds, but scars remained beneath the surface. In his final months, Alexander's plans grew even more ambitious. New campaigns, massive construction projects, visions of further conquest. Some saw genius, others saw obsession. The line between visionary and tyrant grew increasingly thin. And then, suddenly, he fell ill. In Babylon, surrounded by generals who no longer fully trusted one another, Alexander's strength faded. As fever consumed him, questions lingered unspoken. Had power changed him? Or had the impossible burden of ruling a vast, diverse empire forced him into choices that alienated those closest to him? When he died, no clear successor stood ready. His empire fractured almost immediately. The unity he had fought to create dissolved into decades of war. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is not that Alexander became a tyrant, but that he walked a path where heroism and tyranny existed side by side, inseparable. He was a liberator to some, a destroyer to others, a visionary attempting to unite cultures, and a king whose ambition demanded absolute loyalty. History remembers him as the Great. But greatness carries a cost, and in the shadows of his final years, we glimpse a human story far more complex than legend. The story of a man who conquered the world and slowly lost the trust of those who knew him best. Because power does not simply reveal who we are, it transforms us. And sometimes, the greatest victories leave the deepest loneliness.